Hi and welcome to another Watch Geek video. Today I'll be doing the second part of the tutorial for the Casio PRW 2500, where I will cover the ABC functions as well as the moon phase and tide graph function and the record screen. Now if you're interested in the first part of the video where I did the actual review of the watch as well as the tutorial on how to adjust things and use the basic timing functions like the stopwatch, timer, alarm, and etc., you can click on this link right here, which will take you to that video. Also, like in all my other videos, in the description you will find a table of content with time codes so you can jump to specific parts of the video or functions of the watch. Now the first function that we're gonna cover is the moon phase and the tide graph, and as you can see, these are actually visible in the main screen. If for some reason they're not, if the watch is in this mode where it shows the full calendar and not the tide graph function, pressing the adjust button is going to cycle you to show the tide graph function. Now while in the home screen, the moon phase and the tide graph are going to be displayed for the current time of the current date. However, once you move into the actual function, the tide is going to be displayed for 6 a.m. of the current date, and it's always like this, so it always starts at 6 a.m. Also, once you're in the tide graph and moon phase function, the watch is going to display the age of the moon. Right here in days, it's going to display the moon as it is. Now it's invisible because it's becoming a new moon. And if you want to see the tide for different hours of the day, you press the middle button, and as you do, you can see how the tide graph is moving to the right. So now we have a low tide and all the way until you get to the midnight. When you get to midnight, pressing this again is not gonna move to the next day, but it's gonna cycle you back to the beginning of the current day, like this. And if you want to see the moon phase and a tide graph for different dates, you use these two buttons. So you can go back in time at any date you want, and as you can see, the watch is gonna adjust everything, or you can go forward in time to whichever date you want. Now the tide graph, as you can see, and the moon phase changes accordingly. Now the tide graph actually has two functions, two different things that it shows. The first one is the actual tide by blinking from left to right, whether you're currently in a high tide, a low tide, or somewhere in between. But there are also different levels of the tide depending on the cycle of the tide. So currently the watch is showing you a spring tide, meaning that you have the highest difference between a high tide and a low tide. So you have very high tides and very low tides. However, as you move through the cycle with this button, you will see that the tides is going to change to this. This is an intermediate tide. So now you have a medium difference between a high tide and a low tide. And if we move on, we're going to come to what is called the neap tide, where you have the smallest difference between a high tide and a low tide, or you have very low high tides and very high low tides. Now, if you're interested in how this is connected to the moon phase function and how the moon, in accordance to the sun, actually reacts with the water on our planet, I would advise you to check my video of the GW7900, where I go through this function in detail and explain with animation how the moon affects our oceans and everything. So I'll just put a link right here if you want to go and check that video out. Anyways, this pretty much is what you can do in the tide and moon phase function. Now when it comes to calibrating this function, you can do two things. Now to calibrate, you press and hold the adjust button, and the watch is going to enter the calibration mode. And now the first thing that you can do is change the time of the first high tide for your location. Now, although in most places on our Earth this is pretty accurate, there are places, because of their terrain configuration, where the high tide actually occurs slightly different, not at this time but at a different time on these dates. Now to correct this, you can find the tide tables for your location, then enter this adjusting screen and change the first high tide for the day for your location. Now pressing the mode button is gonna move you to the minutes, so you can be really precise. Now, if you press the mode button again, the watch is not going to go back to the hours, but it's going to now ask you to choose whether you want a southerly or a northerly view of the moon. What does this mean? Well, this means that if the moon passes, let's say, south of you, like this, now this is a southerly view, And if it's a quarter of the moon, let's say you see the visible side on the left while the right side of the moon is invisible. However, to a person on the other side of the planet, the moon is flipped, so the visible side for them is the right side while the invisible side is the left side. So this way you tell the watch what is the correct view of the moon. So you've pretty much flipped the view of the moon on this display. Now the manual says that you should use a compass when you observe the moon to see whether it's passing south of you or north of you, and then with this button just change whether it's a northerly view or a southerly view. However, to me it seems simpler and more logical to simply observe the moon, and if it's identical to the one displayed here, you're okay. If it's not, if it's flipped, you simply change the view that you're using. And by pressing the adjust button, you exit the calibration of the moon phase and tidegraph function. Now moving on, we're going to cover the compass function. To activate the compass, you have to be in the home screen or in any of the sensor functions. So while you're in any other function that's not home screen or any of the sensor functions, pressing the comp button is not going to do anything. So you always have to go back to the home screen. And with this watch, you can do it by just pressing and holding the mode button for more than 3 seconds, no matter what mode you're in. Okay, so now once we're in the home screen, pressing the comp button is going to activate the compass. And the compass is going to detect the direction and measure for a full 20 seconds, after which it's going to simply turn itself off. To restart it at any point, just press the comp button again, and another cycle of 20 seconds just began. So you can do it as much as you want. Now, please observe that there are two actual modes of the compass. The first one is like this, so where you see the north, the other sides of the world, and the watch is also showing you which direction you're pointing at by telling you the direction and the bearing. However, there is another mode of the compass where, let's say, if you want to go that way, you don't have to remember this bearing and this side of the world, but simply pressing the adjust button is going to store the current bearing in memory. And now the compass display is going to change to only 2 lines. This one still represents north, these 3 lines, but this line represents the direction that you want to go or that you stored in memory. Also, please note that this is not going to be canceled no matter how often you reset the compass like this. Even going back to the home screen and then doing anything else with the watch, a stopwatch, using any other function, when you go back to the compass, the bearing is still stored, just as you can see. And the only way to clear it is to press the adjust button. And now the memory has cleared, and the compass is going to return to its usual look, where it shows you the sides of the world and it shows you the direction where you're pointing the watch. Now please note that the current time is visible in almost all functions, which is really a great feature. Now another thing that you can do in the compass mode is the declination setting and also the calibration of the compass. To do any of those, you press and hold the adjust button, and the watch is going to enter the setting mode. Now the first thing that the watch asks you is what the magnetic declination is. The magnetic declination is the difference in degrees between a true north and a magnetic north. So this is something that when you use maps that use true north, they're going to have the magnetic declination written on them in degrees, whether it's east or whether it's west or east. So you use these 2 buttons to go either west or east in degrees. Now please note that this watch can only do magnetic declination in full degrees. So if you have a map that has, I don't know, 6.3 or 6.7 degrees, you're going to have to round up the degrees. Anyways, this allows the watch to be a lot more accurate when you're using a map that uses true north instead of magnetic north. If you're using a regular map where there is no magnetic declination written on it, you simply leave this at 0 and the watch is gonna ignore the magnetic declination. Okay, the next function that you can do, like I said, is the calibration of the compass. And this watch offers 2 ways of calibrating the compass. The first one is the bidirectional, which is pretty often on most Casio watches today. So pressing the mode button is going to cycle you through different modes of the calibration, as you can see. So like I said, after magnetic declination, the first one is the bidirectional calibration, where you press the comp button while the watch is pointing in one direction and you have to keep it level. And then once the watch calibrates in that direction, it's going to tell you to change the direction and turn the watch 180 degrees around like this, and now press the comp button again. If everything's okay, the watch is going to write okay, as you can see. If it's not, it's going to write you the error message. Okay, and the second calibration, also press and hold the adjust button. The second calibration, we go with the mode button, is the northerly calibration. Now this means that you can correct this watch if you have a compass by your side. So as you can see over here, nothing is moving because it's intended for you to use the compass, and where the compass is pointing to north, you align this watch with it and press the comp button for the watch to calibrate the desired direction. So you tell it where north is in case it gets messed up. Now, I won't be using this because I don't have a compass here, and because it's pretty much unnecessary unless the watch is really messed up. Now, please note that if you're going to use both of these calibrations to make the compass as accurate as possible, you have to do first the bidirectional calibration and then this calibration, the northerly calibration. Why? Well, because the bidirectional cancels this one. So if you do this first and then move to the bidirectional is going to erase from memory what you did on this northerly calibration. So just keep that in mind. So if you're doing both, first do this, and then once you calibrate it like this, move and do this. And that's going to make the compass function as accurate as possible. Now pressing the mode button returns you, pressing the adjust exits the calibration mode, and pressing the mode button takes you back to the home screen. Okay, so now we're going to move to what I find to be one of the most useful features of this watch, and it's the barometer function. So to enter the barometer function, you just press the baro button, and the watch is going to enter it. Now, the few things that watch is going to display first is the temperature. Now, this means that the barometer function also is the thermometer function. And also, as you can see, the watch still displays the current time. Now, please note that if you want a correct temperature reading, you have to take off the watch from your wrist for at least 10 to 15 minutes, because otherwise the heat from your wrist is going to be transferred to the watch, and this information is not going to be correct. Now, the second thing that the watch displays is the pressure, as you can see right here. The third thing that the watch displays with this little line is what the difference is between two last measurements. So it can be from -5 and -10 hectopascal all the way to +5 or +10. This helps you determine the tendency of the barometric pressure, whether it's constantly going down or constantly going up. Now, once you enter the barometer function, the watch is going to measure the pressure every 5 seconds for the first 2 minutes, and then it's going to switch to every 2 minutes for the next 24 hours, or until you exit the screen. So if you're not touching anything like this, the watch is going to keep measuring pressure for the next 24 hours, like I said, every 2 minutes, and then it's going to automatically exit to the home screen. However, please note that even while you're in the home screen, the watch constantly measures the barometric pressure or the atmospheric pressure. However, when you're in the home screen, it does it in 2-hour intervals. So it checks for the pressure every 2 hours and puts these dots here. So each one of these dots represent 2 hours, and up and down they represent 1 hectopascal. What this means is that this is the most useful function of the watch because it can allow you to predict weather. So if this is constantly going down, that means that the weather is about to get worse. If it's constantly going up, the weather is going to get nicer, and if it's a straight line, that means that the weather is pretty stable. So as you can see, a pretty useful function. Also, while you're in this function, in the barometer function, the watch constantly measures and compares the last 10 hours of measurements. And if it detects a sudden change in pressure, let's say a sudden rise, a sudden fall, or a tendency of a sudden fall to sudden rise, it's gonna beep and write down an arrow here, either upward arrow, downward arrow, a U-shaped arrow, or A-shaped arrow. And I'll put a picture right here so you can see all the symbols that are available. But the only thing to remember is that upward arrow is good weather and downward arrow is bad weather. Anyways, that's pretty much it when it comes to the functionality of the barometer. Now, the last thing that you can do is the calibration, just like in all the other functions, by pressing and holding the adjust button. There. And now, if you think that the watch is off when it comes to checking, when it comes to the temperature or pressure, you can use a really precise thermometer and a barometer to calibrate it by moving with these buttons up or down, and pressing the mode button is going to switch to the pressure, so you can again go up or down. However, I would not advise you to change this because this is pretty accurate. Also, if you want to go to the factory default, you just press these two buttons simultaneously and the watch is going to go to the factory default. When you want to exit the adjusting mode or the calibration mode, you press the adjust button. And that's pretty much it. Pressing the mode button takes you back to the home screen. Okay, so the next function is the altimeter. Pressing the Alti button is going to take it to the altimeter. Now, once you enter the altimeter, the watch is going to start measuring the altitude every 5 seconds for the first 3 minutes, and then it's going to switch to one of two modes. It's either going to continue measuring every 5 seconds for the next hour, or it's going to switch to measuring every 2 minutes for the next 24 hours. And these modes depend on what you select as an interval of measurement in the calibration screen. Now, to enter the calibration screen, you press and hold the adjust button, and the watch is going to ask you for the current altitude, which you can change with these two buttons. And this is important to do very often, or as often as possible, because the altimeter actually works by calculating the altitude based on the barometric pressure. And since barometric pressure changes with weather, even if you're stationary at one place, within hours this altitude can actually change, which makes the altimeter pretty inaccurate as time passes by. However, when it comes to detecting a difference in altitude, it's pretty precise. Although, like I said, this is the V2, which means that it measures in 5-meter increments, while the V3 can measure in 1-meter increments. But as long as you calibrate this pretty often, which means whenever you're at a start of a climb and you have a reference point, let's say a table that says, a sign that tells you which altitude you're on, or if you have a topographic map with altitudes written on it, as soon as you reach your reference point where you know what the altitude is, you should use these buttons to correct this reference altitude. And now pressing the mode button while in this calibration screen takes you to the interval selection. Now, as you can see, this means that the watch is now in the interval of measuring altitude every 2 minutes for the next 24 hours. By pressing the lower button, the Alti button, you can switch it to measuring every 5 seconds for the next hour. So it depends on how fast you're climbing. If you want the most precise climb, but you know it's going to be over in less than an hour, you can use this interval. If it's a slow climb that takes hours, you can use this, and the watch is gonna measure, like I said, for the next 24 hours. And if you don't touch anything after 24 hours, it's gonna return to the home screen. Once you've calibrated everything, and you can, like I said, move with the mode button through different things that you calibrate, pressing the adjust button exits back to the altimeter. Now, just like in the compass and the barometer, which I failed to mention, pressing the Alti at any point just restarts the cycle of the 3 minutes and then the 24 hours. So whenever you press this, you just restarted the cycle. Also, just like in the barometer, there is this line, as you can see, that just highlighted that the difference between the last two measurements was -5 meters. So this scale is used to measure the altitude gain or loss depending on the last measurements. Now, the watch, while in this mode, displays this. This is the absolute altitude, and this is the relative altitude. Now, the absolute altitude is actually the altitude from the sea level, and as you can see, it's pretty messed up here because of the change in weather and everything. This right here shows you the difference between what you set up as a reference point. So let's say if you're starting your climb and this is the sea level altitude, by pressing the adjust button, you clear this reference altitude to 0. So now if you climb by 15 meters, over here it's going to write 0, but over here it's going to write plus 15 meters because you just gained 15 meters. So this helps you track the difference between 2 points when you're climbing or descending. Now, whenever you start the altimeter measurement cycle, the watch actually stores some data. So that when it comes to the things that it stores, it can store a manual data where you can press and hold the altimeter button to record this screen. So let's say like this, rec hold, and there. Now the watch stored in memory the current altitude and the time when that altitude happened, also the date. And you can do it as many times as you want. There. So let's say if you just conquered a summit and you want to store the date, the time, and the altitude that you were on, you can record it with this button. Now this manual recording has room for 14 entries, so you can store up to 14 manual records. When you do a 15th, the last one simply gets dropped or erased, so the watch just keeps rewriting the older entries with newer ones. And you can also manually clear that, but that is in the record screen that I'm going to show you right away. Right after this. Also, the watch automatically stores the minimum altitude that you've ever been to, the maximum altitude that you've ever been to, and it also stores the cumulative ascent and descent. So whenever you enter the altimeter mode, the watch is going to check whether the current altitude is minimum or maximum of all your altitudes that you have stored before you clear them. And if you're at a minimum, it's going to store that minimum in the record screen. If you're at a maximum, it's going to store that maximum. And also any altitude gain or loss is going to be added to the one that's stored in memory. However, please note that the altitude change is not going to be stored unless it's more than 15 meters. So the minimum for the watch to add to the cumulative ascent or descent is 15 meters. And this pretty much covers the altimeter functions. Now we're going to go to the record screen, and you press the mode button to exit it. And we're going to go to the record screen so you can see what data was stored and how to use it. Now pressing the mode button twice takes you to the record screen. This watch has actually 3 screens to display. The one is the manual records, and it says rec, and this is the number of the entry. Pressing the middle button takes you to the what's called Max 1, which is the first automatic storing screen, and then Max 2, which is the second automatic storing screen. So like I said, this watch can do manual records where you tell it what to record, and it has the automatic recording. And the automatic screens are actually 2, and the watch always stores in both at the same time all the same data. And I'll just explain in a second why that is important. Okay, let's go back to the record screen. Now, like I said, over here you can have up to 14 entries stored. Now, to move through different entries, you use these 2 buttons. So you can go backwards 1, 3, 2, or you can go forwards 1, 2, 3. And as you can see, the watch displays the altitude that you were on let's say 9th of October at 1644. Okay, see here, this is the one that we recorded just a couple of minutes ago. So this is the current altitude, this is the date, this is the time, and it can do for all the entries. Now when you want to clear the memory or delete entries, pressing the adjust button while in the record or manual entry selection will clear all the manual entries that you had. So please be careful. If you want to clear just one, you cannot. They're going to get accumulated to 14 and then going to be replaced, like I said. But if you want to clear them, you're going to clear them all at once. So pressing the adjust button just clears the whole manual record screen. So there's nothing left here. And now, like I said, we can move to the first of the automatic screens. Now the automatic screen is going to show you the maximum altitude that you were on with the date and the time. And pressing these 2 buttons is going to cycle you through different data displayed. So this is the maximum altitude. This is the minimum altitude that the watch was on ever in its history before clearing anything. This is the total ascent, and this is the total descent. And like in that record screen, you can clear either the whole screen of automatic 1 or the whole screen of automatic 2. Now as you can see, these 2 are identical there. So now to clear them, let's just go to the number 1. So to clear it, you press and hold the adjust button, and it's going to clear the first automatic screen. So now it's completely clear, and the only one left is the second automatic screen. So now I'll try to explain why the watch has 2 automatic screens. and why you can clear them each one. Okay, so let's say if you go to a 3-day or 4-day or 5-day hike, but let's say it's a 3-day hike, you will have climbs on each of those days. So the first day you come and you start your climb, you initiate the altimeter function, and the watch is going to store you, and by the end of that day you exit the altimeter with the mode button, and the watch is going to store in both of these screens, both the max 1 and max 2, the minimum altitude, the maximum altitude, the total elevation, and the total ascent and total descent. And this data is going to be the same in both screens, in max 1 and max 2. So now let's say a second day comes and you start your second climb. You again initiate the altimeter function, but before that you go and clear the max 1 by pressing the adjust button. And now this screen is completely empty while this one still has data. So now you go to your second climb, you initiate the altimeter, and now the watch again in the screen 1 is going to store the maximum elevation of that day, of the second day, and minimum elevation of the second day, as well as the ascent and descent of the second day. So just the second day. This screen right here is going to add the ascent to the already existing ascent and descent to the already existing descent. So you're going to have a cumulative ascent and descent for both days. And when it comes to the maximum and minimum function, it's going to check whether the maximum of the second day is higher or lower than the maximum of the first day. So if it's lower, it's going to leave the maximum of the first day, and if it's higher, it's going to put the maximum of the second day. And the same goes with the minimum. So in the screen 2, you're going to have the maximum and minimum of both days. So whichever day you achieved the maximum. Okay, so let's say you go to the day 3. So you have your final and third ascent. You again clear the max 1. So again, as you go and climb, this screen is going to show you the maximum and minimum of day 3 climb, as well as the ascent and descent of day 3. Now max 2 is going to add the data from day 3 to days 1 and 2. So now this screen 2 is going to show you the ascent and descent of all 3 days of climbing. And also the maximum and minimum, it's going to compare the third day to all the other days, and it's going to show you the maximum of all 3 days and minimum of all 3 days. That's why it has 2 automatic screens, because that way you can track each day individually and also the cumulative of all the climbs that you did. I don't know if I was clear enough, but this is how you use this record screen. And you can also clear naturally the max 2 by pressing the adjust button. And now everything is cleared in the memory. Okay, pressing the mode button and holding it takes you back to the home screen. Well, this pretty much covers everything there is about this watch when it comes to the ABC functions and the rec screen and the moon and tide graph function. And like I said, if you want to check the first part of the tutorial to understand everything about this watch, you can click on the link that was at the beginning of this video. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. If you did, please like and subscribe. And until the next video, bye.